Greetings and welcome to our first edition of our new series of Pilecki discussions on the history and legacy of totalitarianism. Our topic today is going to concern the role of social media and cyberspace in Russia's war on Ukraine and on the present-day politics and conflicts more generally. My name is John Cornell. I am a member of the Pilecki Institute's Center for Totalitarian Studies here in Warsaw, Poland, and I will be your host today. With me are two distinguished guests, Dr. Ian Garner and Dr. Ksenia Yurtayeva. Ian Garner is a scholar of Russian war and propaganda. He studied at the St. Petersburg State Conservatory in the University of Bristol before completing his PhD at the University of Toronto in 2017, and is at present an instructor in the Department of Politics at Queen's University, Canada. He has written on Russian media opinion and history for publications that include The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Globe and Mail, Haaretz, and others. He is a regular on television and radio around the world and is the author of Stalingrad Lives, Stories of Combat and Survival, published in 2022. His newest book, which is the center of our discussion today, is titled Z Generation, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth, and is coming out next month, in May of 2023, to be published by Hurst and Oxford University Press. I'm sorry I do not have an actual physical copy with me. Ian, hold it up, there you are, in bookstores next month. With us also is Ksenia Yurtayeva, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Criminal Law and Criminology at the Kharkiv National University of Internal Affairs, and is currently a visiting scholar at the Weiser Diplomacy Center in the Gerald Ford School of Public Administration at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She has published extensively on subjects of international justice, cybercrime, and cyber victimization, and is at present working on the research project Cyber Aggression as a Method Applied in Contemporary Warfare, and is also participating in the Reckoning Project, Ukraine Testifies, under the auspices of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. She and her colleagues have most recently been researching the topic cyber threats in the Russian-Ukrainian war, Telegram-based resistance among Ukrainian government-led volunteer forces. So Telegram and TikTok, now the weapons of choice. So let me begin by asking you, just simply, tell us a little bit about the Z generation, or Z generation, I guess, what it is, what role it plays in the current conflict. Ian, you're muted.
Of course, it is inevitable that I begin with myself on mute. So as far as I'm concerned, the Z generation is still a possibility rather than a reality, right? There is still no mass generational movement, even amongst younger generations of Russians, that has turned Russians into sort of bloodthirsty fascists, right, en masse. You know, we're not seeing the kind of mass movement that we saw in Nazi Germany, for example. However, what we are seeing is a slightly different form of support, and this is what I'm interested in the book. The ways that the state is using, in particular, social media to create a kind of performed or performative reality. And this is where I'm not going to bore you with the theoretical details, but I'm very influenced by, you know, sort of postmodernism, Judith Butler material coming out of gender studies and cultural studies about the way that reality is created through words and language rather than just sort of, you know, socio-political realities. And the state, the Russian state, understanding that it can't create mass movements due to the influence of the internet anymore, has instead decided to create alternative realities for young people that exist within the internet. And it is a mistake, I essentially argue in the book, to assume that Russia's children are inevitably going to be moving down a path towards liberal democracy, towards opposition to the state, merely because they have access to the internet. What the Russian state is doing is constructing a sort of glittering, appealing reality based around social media, based around influencers, using kind of quite slick video production techniques, social media campaigns, gamification of joining in social movements, in which to be Russian is to be a good citizen, and to be a good citizen and a good Russian is to be on the inside of these social media realities. To be on the outside is to be liberal, Democrat, clearly Ukrainian, but also homosexual, transgender, anything that can be labeled, and of course Nazi and fascist are the sort of the terms for this vision of the non-Russian. Anything that is not Russian can be fascist today. To be on the outside means to be a traitor, to be excluded from society, to be refused access to careers, to career paths, to be attacked by the government, by propaganda, and potentially even, and I'm sure we'll have the chance to get into this, potentially even attacked by your peers on social media, online, for not fitting in. The social media bubble of goodness, of Russianness, though, this is a space in which everybody supposedly can transform themselves by performing Russianness, by putting on paramilitary youth group uniforms, by saying the right things, by speaking a language of Putinism. And I'm not sure whether I would call it Putinism, but it works as shorthand. A language of sort of officialdom, a language of Putinism, using stock phrases, proclaiming their adherence to the group. And the beauty of social media is that what we see is this snowballing effect, right? We all know it from viral effects, confirmation bias, groupthink. The further you get into the group, the more that the group's language seems normalized, no matter how obscene it is. And thus we find in these groups, the state drips in highly aggressive, highly nationalist, violent, and I would say racist, and I argue in the book fascist rhetoric, and I know that some people are very loath to use the term fascist. I'm comfortable with that, and I'm sure we could talk about it if you're interested. And thus, as the state produces these realities, it's also attempting to isolate Russia in some way, in a way that hasn't, I think, been attempted before. They are speeding up blocking of access to outside sites. They are speeding up sort of show trials of young people who are using sites like Instagram and other sites that are seen as American. And thus, people on the outside, the burgeoning opposition or the potential opposition, find they lack the spaces and find they lack the language to connect with each other. And that's why I worry that as the state gets deeper and deeper into this, the longer it goes on, the fewer the chances are that young people will actually find paths towards opposition to the government. And even if they do, the chances of them finding other people who are opposed to the government become more and more diminished.
How far is the reach then of the Russian government in terms of the internet, in terms of social media? How, for instance, how difficult do you find it now to connect with people over there and have conversations?
Well, I mean, personally, when I was writing this book, and the book is all about people, it's all about characters, I interviewed a whole group of people who were sort of mixed up with this weird world of theatrical performance. I actually found it surprisingly easy to talk to the sort of drum-beating nationalist crowd. Of course, I had to reach out to a lot of people before people agreed, but mostly from the nationalists, I got at least a response, even if most of the responses were, and I'm not exaggerating, you're a Western propagandist, you're just going to twist my words, go F yourself. But lots of others were quite willing to talk to me because they're very proud of this sort of nascent patriotism. They genuinely live in this reality. And this was one of the weirder things I found when I was talking to them, where I would explain to them that, they would tell me that, we're doing a good thing in Ukraine, we're defending Russia, we're saving ethnic Russians. It's like, okay, so far I can see how you would believe that, even if it's wrong. And I would say to them, but hold on, here X thousand Ukrainians have died. Here's Bucha, here's Irpin, here's the terrible things that are happening. Isn't that wrong? And they would say, without missing a beat, because they have this language, it's been fed to them over and over again. They have these sort of stock phrases, almost idioms, and they would say, well, no, you're the fascists, we're saving the world, we're the good guys, right? And that gives them a confidence, right? It's an almost sort of unshakable confidence they're doing the right things. It was much harder to talk to people on the other end of the spectrum. And the book is roughly split between talking to people who feel on the outside in this new reality and people who feel on the inside. And the people on the outside, very frightened to speak, very worried about speaking. And unlike repeatedly that fluency that the pro-government crowd have when they speak, when I was interviewing the anti-government crowd, just in terms of the way they express themselves, constantly silences, stuttering, pauses, struggling to find the terms to express, I'm a young gay man. Here's the way the state is destroying my sense of selfhood. Or I talked to a young ethnic Korean teacher. I think of all the moments when I was researching the book, this one stuck with me the most. This ethnic Korean teacher from the east of Russia who's teaching in Moscow, who just almost couldn't speak at all when she was talking about her sort of fear of the state, the idea that the state is compiling lists potentially of Ukrainian teachers and may come for ethnic Koreans next once it's done with Ukrainians. And I don't think that that's an unfounded fear, right? The state seems to be constantly seeking victims. And so it's very hard to get those people to talk, but still I was actually amazed by the fact that some people within Russia that I spoke to, there was at least one prominent LGBTQ activist who's living in Yekaterinburg, who spoke to me and said, don't anonymize me. You can use my surname, use my real name, say anything you want. These people still exist in Russia, but I worry about the upcoming generation who are just a little bit younger, who don't remember a time when these sort of divides didn't run through society so openly, at least, and weren't encouraged by officialdom so much. And I wonder, actually, Ksenia, what do you think about this? The ability to kind of, I don't know if you're trying to talk to Russians right now, or if it's just something that's too hard, or whether your colleagues are trying to do the same thing.
Yes, thank you for inviting, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss your interesting book. I read it and it was quite amazing. And maybe I'll start a little bit with discussing the topic of the book also, the Generation Z. And in my opinion, it's a very precise name, because it actually can combine two folds of this notion. Also, the Z that is used in this war by the Russians, there is several substantiation. What does it mean and what they wanted to put in the sign? But it's also the generation that was born in their middle 90s and till probably the middle 2010s. And it's interesting that this is completely different generation, that they grew up and rely on the computers much more than, for example, our generation. So I think I like the name of your book, because right now it's very actual, and it makes people think, what do you mean, and how it will influence the Russians generation, which is influenced by the war, and not even fascists ideology, but the Russian ideology, what is a new term that is coming up, the vandalized use of their nationalism and their extensive use of this ideology that is trying to put everything in line in Russia, but also they influence the outer policies. And it's not surprising what you are talking about, that people are afraid to speak up, and some of them have very diverse views, even inside one family. So, and people who, for example, myself, I live in Ukraine normally, but right now I'm situated in the United States. But I can see that a lot of families inside Ukraine and people who have relatives in Russian Federation, they don't really can find the common sense in this situation. They can't really discuss it, and they try not to talk about politics because they do hold different views because of their things they hear from social media. And social media is really the source of the information right now. For example, I don't know how, I don't have their exact details about Russian Federation, but for example, in Ukraine, 77% of the population, they use social media, and 66% of them, they use Telegram, for example. So I was studying their influence for the Telegram. So the narratives that are coming up from the social media are really influencing the people. And as you put it very right, that social media is really a new reality for a lot of people, and they are really a source of information that this is something they would believe. And it's very hard sometimes to really start to understand how to persuade other side. And in the beginning, for example, what I can say that, for example, when there was just the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there were some people trying to send some messages, for example, for the restaurants in Russian Federation, to the St. Petersburg, and like for the review pages saying about their war, but it was some volunteer actions, but it didn't really help it, because the people of the other side were already under some kind of informational pressure.
I'd like to ask, speaking of fascism and so forth, how has the whole landscape of the internet and social media changed this whole essence of fascism, and the ability of states to shape and control people's understanding of reality? Does it make sense to talk of it in terms of fascism, or is it something that is beyond that, because it is the ability to shape people's minds, to provide disinformation is just so much greater? How do you feel about that?
Well, the argument I make in the book, I'm going to do a plug for somebody else here. This book, Late Capitalist Fascism by Mikhail Bolt-Rasmussen, I think is probably the best book on fascism I've read in the last few years. You know, once you go past the classics that are 20, 30 years old now. And Rasmussen makes the argument that really fascism in the social media era is something that can perpetuate itself without formal party institutions, right? Because of the ability of fascism to create a world in which, as I describe in the book, a fascist rally can go on 24/7, right? Back in the day, in the 1930s, if you wanted to form a totalitarian movement or a fascist movement, you needed a party, you needed youth groups, you needed, of course, broadcast media, newspapers, radio, television, film. But ultimately, people at the end of the day could turn themselves off from that reality, right? Could turn up, perform at the fascist youth group, go home, and then believe something different. It was easy. But nowadays, what do we all have in our pocket? We have a phone constantly. And one of the things that I want to bring to the table in the book is the fact that not only can social media create realities, social media doesn't create a different reality from the one that you're living in, right? When we thought about the internet sort of 10 years ago, we often used to talk about, well, you know, online I was one thing, but in real life, I do something different. And the argument that I want to make, coming from more recent media scholars, is that actually that distinction doesn't really exist anymore. Your social media life is your life. And therefore, when Russians live in these social media realities and they speak of violence online and they share violent clips online, when they create youth groups for children with online campaigns that encourage them to sort of sanctify the Second World War and the idea of sacrificing themselves in the name of war, that is not something that is just empty gestures. It actually creates a reality in which these children, these young people, or indeed older people who are active on social media in Russia too, they can live in that reality and they believe that is real. And I think that is the key to understanding what I just mentioned when I explained that, you know, these people with wild beliefs will tell you, no, this is really true. We really are the good guys, right? They don't just have to say that in their social media reality. They are truly persuaded of it. And they live it out in their day-to-day life as well.
And to me, it's one of the striking things that you talk about in the book is too, that it's a kind of a self-perpetuating, self-creating thing, that you don't even need to have the central government creating the content. The users create it themselves. Becomes, they kind of take part in this, but following the lead of the...
Yeah, and I think you're right. And one of the things, I didn't get into this in the book too much, but one of the things that I think makes that different from the sort of your traditional brand of fascism, if you will, is that this means this is quite uncontrollable.
Mm-hmm.
This is almost quite a risky strategy for the government, because for the Russian government in particular, their control over, and I'm sure Ksenia will have things to add on this point, their control over the internet is not as complete as, for example, China's control over the internet. Mm-hmm. Their knowledge or their possession of surveillance technology is not as complete as China's. And that's why you see, instead of blanket surveillance, you see occasionally one person will be picked out from millions of posts, essentially at random, and sort of held up as this person is the bad guy of the week, right? This person is a villain, and maybe they go to court for denouncing the army, or whatever it's called, discrediting the army, right? But on the other hand, you've seen in Ukraine, and again, I'm about to give this to you, Ksenia, you've seen this sort of ramshackle, uncontrollable nature of social media and the internet lead to all sorts of volunteer initiatives that are actually fighting back against Russia, right? The central government doesn't have to direct absolutely everything in the way it was true during the Second World War, for example.
Yes, of course, I can comment on this. I would just also add that about the fascism, that they don't only need to have an army and their organizations, they also have to have very strong ideology. And this is what is happening right now, their ideological side of all this, and also the engagement, unfortunately, of their Orthodox Church, which is also a strong part of this movement. It's very sad, because in 1990s, when the church was just starting to revive, and it was big, actually, like anticipations that it will really change something in the society. Right now, it's survived, but it's used by the government totally, and in the Russian Federation, and it's very sad that it has a very strong impact on this war as well, because as you can see, their actions of the Russian Orthodox Church is baptizing this war and making it worth. So, of course, the social media is two-sided sword, and it can be used in different ways, and it can be used for making this aggression worse, and engaging more people in their all their aggressive actions. And I would say that there is also a big psychological part of this social media component to the aggression, because right now we don't really understand the mechanism how the social media and information influence on people. It's a big field that is just in its infancy. It's cyber psychology, and we know that generally the news, it lives only 3 days, and then normal people, just ordinarily people, they forget about this. But it has a dramatic influence on on the ordinary people, on their mentality, on their cognition, and on their further actions. So their influence of the news and influence how it's put together, it's of course it started, but right now it's developed so quickly, it's very hard to control. In Ukraine, their internet and the social media was you also tried to use at their part for counteraction Russian aggression. And my recent research with my colleagues is called their we studied cyber threats in their context of their volunteered government-led units. They were formed on the first days of aggression. We studied 2 channels in Telegram. The channel that is called Mriast of Russia and Internet Army of Ukraine. And what they did, they were trying to stop the fakes. They were trying to organize volunteers every day. They had a post asking their volunteers that were not actually some people that we knew their names. They tried to organize as much people as they could to stop the fakes, to block their channels that were sending disinformation. Where they were also trying to block their channels that were also revealing the information about the Ukrainian troops. Once we even had the case that their people in the channels, volunteers, were once requested to give the information about Russian truth, but they were asked to do it very accurate, try to do it safely for their life. But it was only one case, so normally they don't engage volunteers in this kind of things. So these channels are setting up to build up resilience and also to raise information about the war. Also, some of the informational posts that were asked to share was actually to send the information to the Belarusian friends, for example, friends in Russia, to share the information about their atrocities that are going on in Ukraine. Because as you already mentioned, that a lot of people in Russian Federation, they just don't believe it, don't understand. And what is very important, that the facts are not really relevant to the situation anymore. For example, when the annexation of Crimea, the problem was that everybody knew the facts, everybody knew that they were some green people in the green, and that everybody knew actually that it was Russians, but the facts were not relevant anymore. So people don't perceive information, they don't analyze information. And another very big part of their Ukrainian efforts to build up resilience is to build up their generation with their habits of their critical thinking and their media literacy. This is very important, and this project is actually taken part by the different, by the government, by the Ministry of the Digital Transformation of Ukraine, and also by the NGOs. So this is a big part of the work, and this is, I think, the main thing that can work in the long run, and that potentially can be used for counter-aggression.
Ksenia, I'm curious, what is the interaction between Russia and Ukraine in terms of social media, disinformation, so forth? Is there a lot of penetration into Ukraine by Russian disinformation, cyber warfare, and so forth? And is Ukraine able to counter that directly? And is Ukraine actually able to do the opposite, to get re-information into Russia?
Yes, thank you for this question, because right now maybe I'll stop on I'll talk more about the Telegram, which actually it's they're based Russian-based company, but it's used there a lot of both Ukraine and Russian Federation is used in the Telegram because of their anonymous ways of disseminating information, and it's also in one way it's uncontrollable, and it has as we said, a dual sword destination thing. So Ukrainian volunteers are using it to disseminate information, but also their information through Telegram can be perceived, as you already as an answer to your question, it can be received in Russia, in Ukraine, and this fake news, of course, they are also on the territory of Ukraine. But of course, it's not the fake news are not only in internet domain, but also on the not only on the social media, but also in the news. And what the initiatives of the Ukrainian government are to block the fake news. We have their Stop Fake platforms organized by their journalists of Kiev Mogila Academy. They're graduates of this institution. They are blocking. They have their site, and they disseminated information about the fake news. They have their content in 14 languages, which is, and it's very important because right now the Russian Federation in doing the mirror actions, they're disseminating information about the war in different countries. They are translating the content about false information about and fake information about the aggression. So it's also go far much beyond the borders of Ukraine and Russian Federation. So it's in my understanding, what are one of the things Ukrainian IT army is doing is trying to block this channel. So the volunteers, how it's done, their mass of volunteers, they send the request and with to block these fake channels of misinformation.
Just to give you an example of the kind of the alternate reality that Russia is able to create. Well, Russia creates a mirror image of this with its own equivalent stop fake groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the biggest one is called the Vojna s Fakami, War with Fakes. And it has 700,000 subscribers on Telegram. Right. And of course, its stop fakes is fake news about fake news, right? In which it will take material produced by Stop Fake and other groups and say, well, actually, you know, the real reality is that that's all fake. So it's all absurd. But that is a huge reach, right, in the Russian-speaking world. And so once again, what we find is you can self-select into these groups. I have a colleague, Andrew Hoskins, at the University of Glasgow, who calls this your personal war feed. You can choose the reality of the war that you want to exist in by subscribing to the Russian stop fakes or the real Ukrainian stop fakes, right? And actually, there is relatively little crossover between the two, especially on Telegram, which is very fragmented. And Telegram's interesting in particular for this because on Facebook, VK, and other similar platforms, you end up seeing what your friends are seeing. You see what your friends are liking, sharing, and commenting on. And that's a very powerful tool for the Russian state because once in your peer group, there is a critical mass of people joining a certain group or expressing a certain idea, you are going to be pulled towards that idea. But on Telegram, that doesn't happen. You only see what you choose to see. And therefore, it is possible to live, if the government can nudge you towards the Russian stop fakes, you can live entirely within this world and never even catch sight of the other side of it.
Yes, with all their freedom of internet, people are sometimes don't choose to find their other kind of information. They are comfortable in their environment. They live, they created the virtual environment. So this is the idea of their so-called virtual communities that share the common views, and actually they can be influenced in these virtual communities. I would just put one example of this one event that happened recently in Ukraine in March of this year. It was their mass unrest of their youth that happened in the beginning of March by their youth group called Rodan. It actually happened not only in Ukraine but also in Russian Federation. But it's some cultural, some subculture groups that of youth that actually I never heard about them before this unrest happened. Also in my native town Kharkiv. But what was interesting that nobody heard about them, but then we found out that mass groups of youth are coming to the streets and they start the fights. And it's when there is a war and there is unrest also in the cities, it's a great powerful tool to make it worse. So it's just how their aggravation of the situation can come just in just days. Fortunately, these young people were captured. Ukrainian police blames it that it's a part of the Russian influence, so we can't really tell if it's so, but it shows how quickly there are mass groups of people, especially youth, can be influenced, how the new ideas and to get violent, to get on the streets and do something in real world, not only online, but in real world. And it actually was like really scary for me because it's just a real example. This person who was a moderator of this group, he was just 16 years old, the one who was captured. Maybe he had some backup, we don't know, but he said that I wanted just to get money. It was more for, self-expression and getting money from their advertisement. But in other cases, in other situations, when some people would like to do something like this, it just shows how quickly the situation can be influenced in real world by this social media, especially which engage in the youth. So I doubt that the older people will really get on the streets by the social media quickly like this. But the youth is the generation that in their very wide reflection.
I'd like to get back to something you were saying earlier, Ian, about the kind of the lack of control over all of this, that the Russian government doesn't really have that much control over what is going on in social media. How is that going to play out, do you think? I mean, will it still work to their advantage, or will it somehow, you see it getting out of their hands, and something like these kinds of I don't know what you would call them, mobs or flash riots that occur might just spin out of control for them?
I mean, we're getting into the business of speculating
and
guessing, which is always hard. But I'll put my neck on the line, do some guessing for you. What the state understands is that it is healthy for them to give the appearance of a sort of polyphonic, bubbling discourse online, where it's not one group that you have to join to fit in to be a good Russian. There are hundreds, thousands of smaller groups, many of which are astroturfed, so created by people that look like they're ordinary people, but actually they're not. They're paid by the state, or the state has constructed the group in some way. And so you have the impression always that there is an outlet for your anger and your frustration and your rage, because you can go and find a group where maybe there is just a tiny bit of sort of movement and leeway. But actually what you find is, when you work through these groups, when you find that what children are being taught is that they are given, every group has pretty much this same stock language, continues to adhere to the bounds of the possible. So you feel like you're going somewhere, but actually you're not. You're just moving around in circles between different groups. And when a certain personality or sector seems to get out of control, and I think this is what happened probably with Vladlen Tatarsky, the guy that was killed in Petersburg. We don't know exactly why, a few weeks ago, but he was part of this sort of Yevgeny Prigozhin Wagner faction, and was very closely associated with a group called Cyberfront Z, who are a pretty abominable bunch who gather in this cafe in Petersburg, or at least they did until it was bombed. And they have an online group, and we're becoming perhaps a little bit too critical of the state, not in the sense that the war is wrong or the war is wrong in general, but in the sense that we need to go full throttle on the war, that somehow the Russian state has been holding back, which is, its own crazy, unfounded claim, but that's what they believe. What I think will be much more interesting, and maybe interesting is the wrong word for it, sorry, that's a horrible academic's very unfeeling word. What will be interesting to see is if the Russian government really is defeated in Ukraine, a real whoppingly embarrassing defeat, being driven back to where they were on February the 24th, completely losing Crimea, or, having to fight in Crimea, all of which I think you would count as pretty humiliating, although they would try and paint it differently using propaganda, and they might well succeed. If there is discontent at home, how will these different groups and realities start to fragment? We talk a lot about the territory of Russia potentially fragmenting, people thinking of Chechnya and different ethnic regions. What I think is much more likely is that you're going to get sort of a fragmentation that actually doesn't reflect geographical realities, a fragmentation according to these social media realities, where different people in different areas are connecting with each other in different ways, and possibly fueled by this language of violence and hatred, revanchism, and they will pick out, this is my biggest speculation, but my biggest fear, they will pick out new victims to blame for the failure of Russia to be whatever level of great they want Russia to be. And they will blame the ethnic Koreans, they will blame the Ukrainians still, they will blame the homosexuals, they'll blame the Jews, who knows? They'll pick somebody, because that is the nature of the culture, that is the nature of the political discourse that the state has instilled over the last 20-something years, and especially over the last 10 years.
Well, I guess you could say the answer, then, it's not so speculative at all. Is it that they really are quite in control for the moment of the language, of the way that the kind of way of the reality, the way of seeing it, even though they may not be in control of the little groups. And the question is, what happens if they come out of political control? But that's a whole other question.
Root rumors of mass discontent and mass uprising in Russia are greatly exaggerated. I'm interested to see what Ksenia thinks as well, but I don't see it happening. I just don't see how it can happen.
Yes, it's hard to say what would be the consequences if, of course, we hope that this moment will come sooner, but we hope that it's still the social media will be helping with this, but it's still hard to say if it will be division of this social group or uniting, because also you can spread the information, one idea like more like possibly for the whole territory of Russia. So for me, I would not predict how it will happen, because I don't have like this opportunity to do so. I don't know, because I think really the specialists also don't know how it might happen. But of course, I think the disconnect, their key of how you can actually show that the situation is different. It's really they're facing the reality, facing their real situation, because right now we know that there is a new wave of mobilization in Russian Federation. Already youth is starting to think about if they really need it, if I really want to go and like sacrifice a life for something. Maybe I doubt, I should say, maybe don't believe, but they already start doubting it. And when you have to really, it's not something on TV, it's in real life. You have to go, and you don't, what we hear that there is no enough supplies to the military, there is no enough uniforms. When they start to face these realities, when you have to buy your own things to go to the front, and so it's completely different. And of course, this might be, and maybe they will be more understanding that what is happening in Ukraine is real. There are the lives that and the people who are suffering and are not some Nazis that are really pictured in all this news, and that children are not Nazis. And of course, this is really a sad situation when I can hear this hatred speech of the young Russians, for example, sometimes where I don't really look into it, try not to look at it, but sometimes you still see how they send there, like it would be good that more like people in the city will die over there because we didn't kill everybody, but we'll do it later. So it's really sad when their generation is of young people are growing up with these ideas. And of course their education is very important to this process, and their mixture of their what was also in your book, the mixture of their some ideals which are really high ideals, and their ideology which is really bringing people to being hatred to their dehumanization of the enemy, showing that other people are not like you, are some different. They are don't have a face like real people. So this is really sad. And of course, the education is the key to it, and what is happening right now in Russian Federation, and also there what was happening on the occupied territories. The first thing that was going on, that Russians they send their teachers there. So of course, even in Kharkiv region where I'm from, that they were even seeing that they were teachers from the Russian Federation that were chased from. So the first thing that they were doing, they were sending their books, their textbooks, and what we already know that their narratives about the so-called special operations is already in the historical textbooks of the Russian Federation. It's on the exam that for admit to the higher education institution. So if you don't put the wrong answer, you won't pass. And there is already their news that even the teachers are turning their the students, they turn their school teachers, the government, if they don't, they doubt that there is a special operation. There is the news like this. So even people who would say that, of course, like something wrong is going on and I don't want to tell it. So they basically even get turned to the government. And you probably know that in March of 2022, there was the changes to the criminal code of the Russian Federation. They put their liability for undermining their idea of their military operations abroad or so-called peacekeeping operations. So basically, all the people who even doubt it are recognized as they call their some agents of the foreign countries, and this is something that I remember that from history of the Soviet Union. It's their enemies of the state. And I don't know how it will be in the later on, but in the history of Ukraine as well, it was the enemy of the state, and there was a family of the enemy of the state. For example, my family was also my great grandfather was accused, and my great grandmother, she was their enemy of the enemy of the state, and she couldn't work anywhere, so she was excluded from the social life. So we don't know how it will develop, but this is basically excluding the people who are not supporters of this military operations from the social life, from the politics, of course, but also from real life and benefits of this in any kind of society.
So then, maybe I can ask at this point, and you talk about this in the book, what then is it that we can do about the Z generation, about this fascistization of Russia's youth from where we are? What hope is there for counteracting that?
My hope is, despite the impression you might have of me after 40 minutes that everything is very pessimistic and terrible, I actually think there is a lot of hope. That Ksenia mentioned the idea of Russism, and I actually don't love the term Russism. We don't get into it because I worry that it suggests that there is something innate about people born in Russia that makes them violent, right? That makes them aggressive, that makes them imperialistic. And I think it's really important to understand that, you know, that's not the case. Violence is something that is socially inculcated. It is something that the state is teaching to children. The state, along with, as I point out in the book, a great many sort of true believers and fellow travelers who are helping in this mission. But what we can do is, fortunately, because this sort of silicon curtain, as it were, that the state is trying to draw shut around Russia is so flimsy. It's full of holes. You know, it's still easy for us to reach into their social media networks. And I think as an act of defense, we should be reaching in and re-educating young Russian people by being in their social media networks, by creating material that transforms what it can be to be Russian from being something that is exclusively masculine, macho, violent, this sort of twisted form of Orthodox Christianity that Ksenia mentions. These are all things that you have to be a good functioning member of the community. Otherwise, you're cast out right now. But we can find ways to reach in and show children in Russia that actually you do not have to do that, right? That the enemy of the state is actually not your enemy. And the great mistake I think we're making is assuming that the next generation is going to be more liberal, because somehow this is sort of the assumption that we have, that younger people are always more liberal than their parents. And I suspect with the influence of what the state is now doing in schools and military youth groups and online, that is not going to be the case in Russia. And our other mistake is when we do reach into Russia to just try and create real news campaigns, the Stop Fake campaigns, right? Which are useful for certain audiences, but when you're reaching into the world of the true believers, the world of people who believe in the cult of fake realities, they will simply reject your reality out of hand, despite what's really real or what's really a lie, right? They will, you know, you'll reach in and say, well, actually, there are no Nazis in Ukraine. It's Russia that's the fascist nation. And of course, what you're going to get is what I already described. The true believers are going to write back to you and say, no, you're a Western propagandist, go F yourself, right? And so that sort of mass influence campaign is not going to be very effective. It will to a certain degree, but mostly you're just going to persuade people who are already persuaded. And what you are not giving people by doing that is a way to sort of rebuild the links with the rest of the community that says, actually, you can be Russian, you can be peaceful, you can be a homosexual, for example. All of those things can coexist together. That's the way. And it will take millions of messages, right? Millions of views of social media campaigns and influence groups, things like that, to actually make it work to any substantive level. But the point they make in the book is that this is cheap. This is extremely cheap. The cost of an F-16 fighter jet is something like 60 million US dollars. And I'm sure somebody watching this will be into their military facts and figures and will tell me I'm way off on that, but I'm pretty sure it's around. For the cost of one fighter jet, think of the kind of influence operation you could run within Russia. And what we're not doing is lying, right? We're not somehow just spreading sort of CIA conspiracy propaganda. We're saying, here are just alternative ways of being. That is the way that a plurality, a kind of socio-cultural plurality can exist in society. And that's what makes society healthy. It's not the liberal democracy, or it's not the democracy that makes society healthy, it's the liberalism. And liberalism requires plurality. And that is the thing that leads to diminished wars. We know that. The political science research on war and why war happens shows again and again that's true. But you're not going to convince the Russian government, and you're not going to convince the next Russian government either. So you have to convince the people. And ultimately, I imagine that might mean that when the next war comes, whether it's against Ukraine, against the Baltic states, within Russia, because it's a sort of war against some ethnic other, fewer people would be willing to commit the kind of genocidal acts that we're seeing in Ukraine today. That's ultimately that's a good thing, right?
Maybe in a sense, then just showing them what genocide means, what it is, rather than this is what you're doing, this is what your country is doing.
Yeah,
giving them a sense, another set of values rather than another set of information.
It has to begin from values that accept that you can be a Russian and you can be a patriot, at least to start with, right? Because if we just march in and say, here is a set of what appear to be Americanized, westernized values, go away, Western propagandists. Doesn't matter who says it, right? Navalny can say it, Ilya Yashin can say it, Vladimir Kara-Murza can say it, and all of these people will just be enemies of the state because they're seen to be other and non-Russian.
What do you think, Ksenia? Do you think that this would work?
Also, yes, because I like the idea, as Jan put it in his conclusions, that aggressive anti-propaganda won't work. And this was actually when I was reading the book, was also my idea, that they're just saying that everything what you think is wrong, and your history and so on. So what is usually used not only the prohibition and other methods that are also like prohibitive and quite violent towards its own nation, which we also know from the history of Russian. They're using this quite a lot, and people are really actually get a great way of acceptance of the violence against its own people. For example, I was even remembering there when I was reading the book, which was not in the book probably, there was when there was unrest in 1993, and when there was they are shooting against its own parliament in Russia. So it was Russians get used when there is violence, but also there should be what is often used is soft powers. And soft powers, and they don't work immediately, they don't work directly, but in the long run, they give some results. And what is also can be used as a soft power, not like a really prohibition or something as a contrast. As still, as you put in the book, that a lot of Russian people, Russian youth, they like American lifestyle. They like the movies that they see. It was very funny when I was watching the part like when people already filmed it, when it was a Russian podcast on Oscar ceremony, because they can't watch it on TV. So, and when they were saying something about the war in Ukraine, there are people who are doing the podcast in the real life, they just, Russian podcast guys, they just were silent. So it was, so they still watch it, they still try to follow it. And when, as you put in the book, there are celebrities who maybe some Russian youth think that they're authoritative to them. Maybe they will say something what they still do. Maybe it will work in the long run. So they're soft powers. Also, as I think that I don't want, when I was talking about the Russian Orthodox Church, I don't want to say that being an Orthodox is bad, because I'm also Ukrainian Orthodox, so this is their faith, it's important, but it's very sad that when it's used as their politician leverage, so, and putting their like breakage in the society. This is sad when the religion, when real faith of people is used in this way. And of course, the revival of their religion was very short, and when it was put to their back wheels, and it was really influenced in the bad way. So of course, I think that when it will be a very hard mechanism, how it can be complex, but the critical thinking of the situation, and as you say, the discrepancies between the reality and the ideology of the state. But of course, when the child from the very young, when the child is very young and he's been brought in this ideology, it's very hard to overcome it. So of course, it should be also their ideas of the older generation that might also influence their children, maybe not on the official way, but on the family way as well, because I have also children, and I try to educate them, and I understand that my example is the main to them, main things to them. So of course the young generation is important, but also the educating and giving their influence on the older generation that can pass their doubts, their concerns, the younger generation on the unofficial level might be also helpful.
Okay. Any final thoughts before we conclude the discussion? Yeah.
I could just maybe say that, just say that before Jan makes this final conclusion, that the book was, I enjoyed reading your book. It was put in the interesting way. They were, I share your love to literature, so a lot of the books that you were referring to, I either read or read the other books of the similar authors. So their way how you put the history of the Russian Federation and their relationship, for example, also with the West and Ukraine, was also very interesting. So I suggest people who will be listening to this discussion to have opportunity to read this book. So it was interesting to me as well.
I recommend it highly too. It's an excellent book, and just a very important and very timely subject to understand what is going on, not just with the current situation, but with the young generation, and what is going to be the future Russian people. Ian, any final thoughts?
Well, thank you both. And listen, this was an awful book to write, in a way, and I'm a stupid humanist, and it of course it made me deeply sad to be talking to queer Russians who were driven out of the country by the state, who feel that like they're kind of torn apart psychologically, to talk to these ethnic minority youths, to hear about people who just feel like they can never remake themselves in the state's image. But it is also sad talking to the true believers, the people who really believe this stuff, because I remember being in Russia in the 2000s, when it still seemed like there was a lot of hope among the younger generations, and especially the people that really, and there were very many of them at that time, really did not buy into the sort of the anti-West culture and the Putinist culture. And now those people feel like there is nothing left for them. There is nothing in Russia. They feel they have no way to challenge the state. And it does. I don't know, it leaves you with a real sense of despondency about the way that Russia can come back from this. Clearly on the international stage, the ability of the government to rebuild links with the West is not, it's basically non-existent. The ability of the government to rebuild links with Ukraine is unimaginable right now with Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And John, you'll know this, of course, because the idea of Poland and Russia becoming, I don't know, finding even tolerance towards each other right now, it's unthinkable. But it is sad that those opportunities for the children that I wrote about, who 4, 5, and 6, and they have no choice in any of this. You wonder what's going to become of them in 10, 15 years' time, and it is hard to see them living in a better country or being able to find different ways of being. And of course, there will be young gay Russian children who are 4 or 5 now. There will be young ethnic minority children who are going to be the next victims of the state. They're going to continue to be victimized by the state. And that is something that is not going to go away with the end of the war in Ukraine. It's gonna keep going on until there's some deep cultural change in Russia and deep political change as well. And I mean, Ksenia and I just talked about a couple of ways that it could be affected, but it has to come from within Russia as well. And that I don't see happening for now. So cheerful words to end off with. I apologize.
It's a sober subject and discussion, but all the more necessary. So thank you both very much for joining me in this. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you with me here. So thank you once again, and thanks to all of you who are viewing this.